So I am Dr. Peggy Smith. I'm a professor emerita in the Faculty of Natural Resources Management at Lakehead University.
I'm Darren Thomas. I'm a lecturer at the Indigenous Studies program in Laurier, Brantford.
I'd like to acknowledge my Cree ancestry. My spirit name is Misquanakwaduk, which means Red Cloud Woman, and I'm in the Bear Clan.
I'm Seneca Nation Bear Clan from the Haudenosaunee at Grand River Territory.
So Darren and I are working together on a project on implementing free, prior, and informed consent with Matawa First Nations, who are located in the Treaty 9 territory of Northern Ontario, in the area that's known as the Ring of Fire, an area that's been discovered to be very rich in a number of minerals, but in particular chromite. And so there's been lots of discussion going on about how to open this area for development. And but before we start talking about that research project, we were earlier having a discussion about the principle of reconciliation. We were all talking about that principle since Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada put out its calls to action in 2015. And the idea is to put the relationship between Canadians and Indigenous peoples on a new footing, to renew the relationship. So, Darren, you were telling me you had some concerns about this concept of reconciliation and how you think that it's being maybe distorted.
Yeah, my fears have witnessed since the TRC report is that if we look at, by and large, what's been happening in many different areas of Canada, we're still lacking the Indigenous voice in terms of real meaningful change and dialogue of what needs to happen. It's being largely led by governments, by ministries. I mean, they're being funded and mandated to bring reconciliation to reality. But it's still top down, unfortunately, and the Indigenous voice isn't there. And so I liken it to the situation, if you have a perpetrator and a victim, would we ever give power to the perpetrator to decide when we're reconciled? And of course we wouldn't. So we need really to bring Indigenous voice to the forefront. They need to have power in deciding what reconciliation should be and how we should move forward. And if we continue under our current path, unfortunately, it's a sophisticated and a polite way of saying, let's get over it now, without doing the work of really having to explore. I think we're forgetting the T in the TRC, which is that truth. And that truth is hard, that truth is ugly, it's shameful. But we don't explore it to blame or to point fingers or to cause harm to one another. But we have to realize that if we're going to move forward as a society, we must get to the same page before we can turn that page together.
And I think that was well illustrated last night in the talk that Romeo Saganash gave about his private member's bill C-262, which calls for the Government of Canada to review its laws to make sure that they're in compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And he also pointed out that it was also the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their calls to action to adopt the UN Declaration as a framework for reconciliation in Canada. And he made a very impassioned plea and explained his motivation for bringing forward the private member's bill, talking about his own personal experience of being removed from the land when he was 7 years old and incarcerated, he called it incarcerated, in residential schools for over 10 years. And he explained that his work on the private member's bill to implement the UN Declaration was his way of reaching out to Canadians and saying, we can do this in a better way. And this is the way to do it, and it's been acknowledged by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that this is the way forward. So maybe, why don't you talk about Matawa First Nations then and what you've observed so far in terms of whether the principle of free, prior, and informed consent that's contained in the UN Declaration is working on the ground there. And how far do we have to go? What's it going to take to implement that concept of FPIC?
Well, I think it's tremendously challenging, and I think even if the bill gets passed and voted to move forward, that's only the start. I mean, there's going to be so many years of work, really, in actually breaking through different Crown relations in terms of law and social policy and how various acts, in particular mining and the Far North Act and forestry and a lot of these industries that's had significant impact within Indigenous communities for generations in Canada are going to have to be revisited to see how shared jurisdiction could come about and shared decision-making power can actually be meaningful on the lands for these communities that, you know, they're the ones who are directly impacted, you know, when their ecosystems are compromised. And the work we're doing in Matawa, you know, it's been very slow up there, I think, for many of the communities, because understanding all of these different pieces of law and legislation is very complex. It's complex for leaders and for trained analysts, let alone community. And I think that's some of the aspects in terms of FPIC and free, prior, informed consent is how do we translate all of that technical information to community accessible ways and means for them to fully understand not only the potential impacts, but the long-lasting impacts that could come. And what's been interesting is the unfortunate thing in many situations, not just in Matawa, but in many cases we're looking at, the analysis is purely economical. And the promises of jobs or potential infrastructure development. And a lot of what I'm looking at, especially as an Indigenous person, is to bring Indigenous law and philosophy into that analysis. And what are the impacts, you know, for their relationship and to the land and to even being able to practice their indigeneity and continuing to hunt and fish and trap and collect medicines and foods from the land. You know, especially in the remote parts of the country where many of these communities are still reliant on that ecosystem. And if that ecosystem is compromised in any way, you're really disrupting their indigeneity.
So we had part of the research project was to bring folks from Matawa First Nations together to discuss what free, prior, and informed consent means. And what we heard there was that people were very frustrated, one, with their inability to understand or have the capacity to understand how this was going to turn out in terms of the development that was being proposed in their area. And they still feel that what's happening is that the government of Ontario is imposing its system on them rather than co-developing a process in which they feel comfortable. And I discussed this yesterday, but and I think it's important in light of Bill 262 on implementing the UN Declaration, and that is that most of our laws in Canada, doesn't matter whether it's at the federal level or at the provincial level, do not recognize Aboriginal and treaty rights and do not make sufficient provisions for Indigenous peoples to determine the processes that they're involved in. And there's no provision for consent in any of our legislation. So there's some big changes that need to happen, and yet we're in the middle of this kind of major resource development in the north that's promising. How much money did you say that was going to bring in the Ring of Fire?
It's estimated in deposit alone in chromite to be $65 billion. And with all the subsidiary development, well over $200 billion in Northern Ontario.
And many people are, in some ways, desperate for that economic development. We've seen a downturn in the forest sector over the last 10 years. It's starting to revive and come back, but it's still, we lost thousands of jobs in Northern Ontario, and many mills closed down, so people are looking for alternative economic development. And then in the north, of course, our wealth, it is our resources. So people are looking to a new frontier, and with the discovery of the Ring of Fire, the pressure is on to get that development done quickly and have those millions and billions of dollars start to flow in. And so the tendency to rush through this and to pressure Indigenous communities to sign on the dotted line and get with the program are tremendous.
Right.
And when you look at what's going on in those communities in terms of their ability to respond, the movement they have to make away from the way that they've been living to this new type of development, and what that will mean for things like their rights, that is their ability to live on the land, are all the huge questions. And I'm sure people are literally terrified about what the implications of this development will mean in the long term.
Absolutely. I think what's important to realize that when we look at current existing Crown relations, whether it's federal or provincial, many of the directions in this relationship were created and written and formed before Indigenous people were even considered to be human, right? And so as we're trying to advance Indigenous rights as human rights, this is where the problem lies, is we have to revisit some of these relationships and recognizing that Indigenous people need to have access to the basic human rights that are supposed to be provided in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms to every citizen in this country. And that by denying Indigenous people's basic human right to self-determination, we're denying them a significant protection for their safety and security of their future generations.
Yeah, and number one in importance, I think, would be revisiting the historic treaties that have been signed in Northern Ontario. And those treaties were signed in 1850. The Robinson Treaties became the model for the historic numbered treaties that were then negotiated across Northern Ontario, the Prairie Provinces, and up into the territories between 1850 and 1930. Those treaties all have a formula to them, and that formula is based on a Crown understanding that when Indigenous people signed on the dotted line, they were giving up all their rights. They were giving up their right to their land, and what we call ceding or surrendering, and then also giving the Crown the ability to take up land whenever they saw fit for, the language in the treaties is lumbering, mining, settlement, and other purposes. And that was never the understanding of Indigenous people who signed those treaties. They said, we can't give up land that was given to us by the Creator. And when we enter into treaties, it was a sacred trust that we would share lands and resources. Well, that never happened. So it's the Crown's interpretation that's taken over. And so now we're introducing these ideas, again through the UN Declaration, about self-determination and the right of Indigenous peoples to provide their consent before any development occurs, and to work in cooperative relationships with governments around resource development. So is this something we're going to achieve in our lifetime? Do you think that there's hope that we will somehow move away from what we call drive-by consultation processes to something that is meaningful, that has the approval and the involvement of Indigenous peoples and provides for their consent? Can we get there?
I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful. At least if, we have to trust in where our current government is wanting to move things. I know we have to operate in this hopeful light because to not means we're just going to eventually continue to die, which was the plan for Indigenous people not to exist here. But for Indigenous communities to pick up on our Indigenous law and philosophy and protecting future generations, we must engage in these conversations, and we must assert our rights to our basic human rights and self-determination in the hopes of lifting the burden from our great-great-grandchildren, the ones that aren't born. Those that are alive today, we must go through this burden in the hopes that we make their life better. But I'm hopeful.
I think a note of hope is a good note to end on.
Thanks.